Hello, I'm Steve Jackson. I'm Social Media Coordinator for the Society for One Place Studies, and I'm currently working on three One Place studies of my own, including Forsley in Northamptonshire, which you can see as my background, and Waters Upton in Shropshire, which is going to be the focus, the microfocus, if you like, of this presentation. So I've been asked to talk about finding a microfocus within a larger One Place study place, using as an example my own Waters Upton One Place study. Now, Waters Upton itself is quite a small place, but the study that has arisen from small beginnings 12 years ago has exceeded anything I could have anticipated. The screen grab here from my One Place Study website for Waters Upton gives some idea of the range of records and sources that I've been working with, transcribing, making abstracts from, and sharing, including parish registers, census returns, electoral registers, historical directories, memorial inscriptions, land transactions, wills and probate documents, military records, crime reports and other news from the local papers, and maps, of course. There's a blog on the website in which I'm slowly beginning to tell the stories of the people and the history of the place. I've also got an Ancestry One Place study tree, or maybe that's a forest, with 5,520 people in it. This is not a very large One Place study by any stretch of the imagination, but it's far in excess of anything I could have imagined 12 years ago. Fortunately, my study, when it began, had a much smaller focus, a microfocus. I was looking at about 40 gravestones and memorials in Waters Upton St Michael's churchyard, which named 73 people. I photographed those gravestones in September 2011, and that formed the basis of a small cemetery study. And with that study, I began to research and tell the stories of a small selection of the people living in or connected to the parish of Waters Upton. I'm going to tell you some of those stories now in abbreviated form, so they're micro stories, I guess, given the theme of this presentation. And we'll start with a landlady, Lucy Strefford, who was born in 1863 at Sleepford, just to the south of Waters Upton, outside the parish, in neighbouring Arkle Magna, a much bigger parish. And this is a theme you're going to see repeated. In 1886, Lucy married shoemaker John Wild, and 3 years later, the couple moved to Waters Upton, where John ran the Lion Inn, a beer house. After John's death in 1900, Lucy took over as innkeeper, a role she didn't keep for very long because she married William Henry Price in 1902, and he took on that role. But I suspect that in the background, Lucy played a fairly major part in running the establishment. Lucy and William remained at the Lion until the early 1920s. I found them there on the 1911 and 1921 censuses, but not in the 1926 Kelly's Directory of Shropshire. As you can see from the gravestone here, Lucy was eventually reunited with her first husband in 1939. The blacksmith, or a blacksmith, James Ridgway, born at Cold Hatton, just over the parish boundary in Arkle Magna, but quite close to Waters Upton, and that's why he was baptised there. He was living at Waters Upton when he married to Anne Jones in 1837 in the south of Shropshire, and he worked there as a blacksmith all his life. James was a widower for about 5 years after Anne's death in 1846, but in November 1851, he married, or perhaps tied the knot with, Harriet Main Knott. When the census was taken a little earlier that year, Harriet was living at Cold Hatton with James's brother George Ridgway, and with George's wife Elizabeth, who was originally Elizabeth Knott. It turns out that she was Harriet's sister, and I love finding connections of kinship or long and complicated connections through marriage and other relationships between the people of my place. And you're going to see a few more examples of that shortly. A rather more tragic tale next from this particular gravestone, the deaths of 3 infant children within 5 weeks in October and November 1863, children of John and Elizabeth Morgan of Waters Upton, starting with Arthur at the age of 3, then Sarah, age 5, and finally little George, aged just 14 months. I got the GRO death register entries for these 3 and found that all of them died from diphtheria. John and Elizabeth, no doubt devastated by the loss of their 3 children, emigrated to start a new life in America the following year, 1864, and they settled in Geneva, Ashtabula County, Ohio, where they had 3 more children. And those children all survived not just into adulthood, but into their 70s, and in one case to the age of 80. The surgeon, John Ryder, he was born at Crudgington, you've guessed it, just outside Waters Upton in Arkle Magna parish, and he lived all his adult life working as a surgeon in nearby Wellington. I've actually found no records of him living in Waters Upton parish, yet he was buried there, and his gravestone described him as being of Wellington and Waters Upton. Now, John's mother, Sarah Ryder, née Dickin, was of Waters Upton when she married, when the censuses from 1861 to 1881 were taken, and when she died in 1883. So John may well have been a regular visitor to the parish because his mother was living there. And certainly news reports of his funeral give a good indication of the close connection he felt with that parish and that parish with him. A schoolmistress, Anne Walker, originally Martin, was born in Wollerton in Nottinghamshire, but by 1851 she and her husband Joseph, a farm bailiff, were living in Shropshire with their children. Joseph then disappears from the records and presumably from the lives of his family. Censuses after 1851 record Anne as married, but the head of the household, and working as a schoolmistress. By 1871, she was living and teaching in Waters Upton. Her daughter Sarah Ann Walker was living with her and working as her assistant. And after Anne's death in 1880, Sarah stayed in Waters Upton and continued working there as a private schoolmistress. The rector, John Bailey Davis. The more and more I find out about him, the more and more I find out the extent to which he was a pillar of the Waters Upton community and involved in practically every aspect of village life from his arrival in 1866 until his death in 1905. He was far more than simply a rector and Sunday school teacher. He served on the local Poor Law Union's Board of Guardians. He actively supported the Waters Upton Lodge of the Oddfellows Friendly Society. He was a member of the Shropshire Chamber of Agriculture. He played cricket for the village team, and he sent gifts to the Union Workhouse. After his death, his widow Susan lived in the White House, right next door to the church. The couple's children, all born at Waters Upton, included Admiral Sir Arthur John Davies, KBE, CB, who was also buried in the family plot at Waters Upton. And last but absolutely not least, my ancestor. Here's the gravestone of my great-great-great-grandmother, Mary Titley, originally Atcherley, and her husband John, not my ancestor. Mary was a daughter of Samuel Atcherley, who farmed at Moortown in Arkle Magna parish, almost inevitably, and his second wife, Margaret, originally Wace, who had Waters Upton ancestry herself. Before she married John Titley, a butcher with Aglab ancestors, Mary had a child born out of wedlock, my great-great-grandfather Henry Atcherley, who grew up to be an agricultural labourer. Mary died aged just 28 in 1832, so there's very few records of her. And this gravestone with her name inscribed on it is a rare exception. Through Mary and her husband, it turns out, I'm connected in a variety of often delightfully distant ways to a large proportion of the people who lived in Waters Upton. And by reconstructing the population of my one-place study in my ancestry tree or forest and making Mary the home person of that tree, I found that John Ryder, the surgeon, was a maternal first cousin of Mary's. John Bailey Davies, the rector, was the husband of a stepdaughter of Mary's first cousin once removed. James Ridgway, the blacksmith, was a granduncle of the wife of a nephew of the wife of my great-great-grandfather Henry Atcherley. And Lucy Strafford, wait for it, was the wife of a great uncle of the husband of a sister-in-law of Mary's great-great-grandson, my second cousin once removed, Frederick Charles Atchley. I told you those relationships were often delightfully distant. So my initial focus on the occupants of the churchyard at Waters Upton enabled me to research a subset, a selection of the parish's population, get to know the people who lived at Waters Upton, and it was a great way into a larger one-place study. But I have to confess, this wasn't a deliberate choice on my part. I only visited the churchyard to find and photograph my great-great-great-grandmother's gravestone, taking pictures of the other memorials to add to find a grave, finding out more about the people named, turning the results into a one-place study which grew and grew. None of that was planned, but it was a micro focus within a larger place, and it led to a fascinating study of 12 years so far. It worked very well for me, and maybe it could work for you too. Thank you for listening.